In the last two movies, we took a look at the first two types of loops, while loops and for loops. Now we're going to look at the final type, which is for each loops. Now that's for each all run together as one word, and the format of it is going to be for each array as value execute a statement. And this is going to be a little bit different than the other loops, because the other loops were always testing a Boolean, whether it was true or not. For each only is going to work on an array. And the test, the Boolean test for each, is do we have items still left in the array? So for each will go through every single element of the array. Each of those elements in the array will become the value, and the value can then be referenced in the statement. We'll see how that works, and it'll make a little more sense, I think, once you actually get used to it. But the overall idea is that we're starting with an array. For each only works on arrays, and we're pulling each of the elements out of the array in turn, assigning them to a variable name temporarily, and then executing a statement on them. Let's try it and see how that works. So right now I have my for loops file open. Let's go ahead and open a new one. Let's do save as, and we're going to make this one into for each loops. There we go. We'll save that in our PHP sandbox as well, and loops for each. Now the very first thing I'm going to do is get rid of the old for loop, because despite the name, for loops and for each loops don't have anything to do with each other. And then I'm going to paste in a simple array. So here we go. I've got just some ages in there in an array. So an array with 6 elements in it. So our for each loop, we already know, based on that array, is going to execute 6 times, because it's going to use each element of the array. Now for the actual for each loop. It's going to look something like this. For each is going to take the array ages that we created, and each one of those elements is going to be assigned the value age. It's going to be attached to that variable, age. So that makes sense to us if we think about it in an English language style. For each of the elements in ages as age, then echo age dot and so and so. Now you see we haven't defined age anywhere up here. We just defined ages. Age is a temporary variable that the loop is going to use for each element. So the first time through, age is going to be equal to 4, and it's going to output 4 with a comma there, and so on. Let's go ahead and try it. I'll save it. We'll go over to Firefox, and I'm going to instead type in that we want for each loops. And you'll see that it gives us back those ages. Now, you can see that's going to be very useful for us when we want to traverse an array. When we want to either do something to every element in an array. Let's say we had a list of names and we wanted to go through and check whether a name had certain properties before we moved on. Maybe we wanted to clean up the values if there was something wrong with them. Maybe there was some extra white space we wanted to trim out. We can traverse an array that way using for each. Or we can output them in the way we've done here. We could have a list of names, and we could say for each one of the names as name, echo the name, and it would put out that list of names. So this allows us to really make the most out of arrays by being able to loop across all of the values. Now you remember earlier when we were talking about arrays, we talked about 2 different kinds of arrays. There was the simple kind of array like we have up above, and then we also had associative arrays. Remember where we gave labels to all of our file folders, and we had first name, and it had an arrow to Kevin, and last name to an arrow to Skoglund. So we were labeling each of those values. Well, there's a different for each syntax for that case. Let's take a look at that now. For each can also take each array as a key value pair. Just like we assigned it with a key and the arrow with the value, we can do the same thing when we're talking about the for each statement. Again, don't let this sort of schematic view of it throw you off. Let's look at it in practice and it'll make the most sense to you. Let's say that we still have that same array of ages. But this time, instead of just talking about the values that are in each of those, let's actually look at the key for each of those. Now, the key, when we haven't specifically defined it, is the position that it's in, the folder pocket number, if you will. So the key for 4 is 0, and the key for 8 is 1, and 15 is 2, and so on. So using each key value pair, then, we can tell it to output the position that it's in, followed by a colon and a space, and their age, with a BR tag. So you'll see here we've defined it as ages, just the same. We put in the same array. We assigned the position variable to the first key and the age variable to the first value. So let's go ahead and try that. We'll save it. We'll go back into our browser. We'll reload it. and you'll see that we actually get each one. 0 is 4, 1 is 8, 2 is 15, 3 is 16, 4 23, and 5 42. Hopefully that'll make sense to you. Let's try one that uses something besides the index numbers, something that's more associative. I'm going to paste another example right below the previous one. Now, hopefully you can read that okay, but we have an array where we have a first value is going to be brand new computer, and it's going to then point to the value of 2000. So that's our key and our value. And then we're going to say for each of the things in our prices array as key value, then we can talk about if the value is an integer, then execute the first bit of code, and if it's not, execute the other bit of code. Now, some of these values are going to be integers and some of them aren't. Let's take a look and see what we come up with. And there we go. It's a little bit of a goof, but you'll see that brand new computer, $2,000, 1 month in lynda.com training, $25, learning PHP, priceless. So we've used loops to do something that's at least a little bit of a dynamic function. So even though it's a little bit silly, we've now used PHP to develop an array and to create something that's dynamic. For the first time, we're really starting to see how we can create meaningful content that's dynamic using all of these techniques that we've learned so far. Before we leave loops behind and move on to functions, I want to examine a couple more things that we can do in loops. For example, what if we wanted to break out of a loop at a certain point instead of going through until all those conditions were met? And we'll look at that in the next couple of movies.